Could a real person actually fight like Geralt of Rivia? That's the question we set ourselves today, and frankly, it's a dangerous one, because the Witcher's entire combat style exists somewhere in the uncanny valley between grounded medieval swordsmanship and pure cinematic spectacle. The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that many of the building blocks, the footwork, the stance, the use of leverage, come straight from genuine martial traditions. But no, in the sense that Geralt fights with a level of flair and durability that would make even the most hardened knight or duelist throw down his blade, walk off the battlefield, and mutter, "Nope," all the way back to his tavern stall. Let's start with what works. One of the smartest decisions in the Witcher's fight choreography is how they borrow heavily from actual fencing and longsword manuals, particularly the German and Italian schools from the 14th and 15th centuries. If you've ever seen illustrations from Johannes Liechtenauer or Fiore di Liberi, you'll notice that Geralt's guards, low stances, sword held close to the body, cutting lines kept efficient, are shockingly faithful. The Witcher's guard of the falcon looks suspiciously like the posta di donna from Fiore, and when he delivers those sharp, committed thrusts, you can practically hear some dead fencing master whisper, "Finally, someone listened." But then, the flourish comes in. Geralt doesn't just strike, he pirouettes. He doesn't just dodge, he cartwheels half a body length away and comes back swinging like a Cirque du Soleil dropout who accidentally brought a longsword to rehearsal. Visually, glorious. Practically, questionable at best, suicidal at worst. In real combat, the more spins you add, the more openings you leave. A single peasant with a rusty spear could interrupt one of Geralt's twirls with a stab to the ribs, and that would be the end of the Witcher franchise. No Wild Hunt, no Yennefer, no bathtub memes. Just a very awkward obituary. And yet, the spin is part of the magic. Remember, Geralt isn't fighting other medieval humans. He's squaring off against Kikimoras, Strigas, Leshens, Drowners, and monsters pulled straight out of Eastern European folklore. Against a slow, lumbering beast with thick hide and predictable movement patterns, the flourish isn't just stylistic, it's a psychological tool. Monsters, unlike humans, don't get to complain about choreographed acrobatics. They just get confused for 3 seconds while Geralt does a half-turn somersault slash, and by the time their brain catches up, their head is already rolling on the dirt. Another thing often overlooked, Geralt doesn't rely on the sword alone. The signs. Those flashy one-handed spells are the ultimate cheat code. Quinn, for example, is basically a medieval energy shield. Try explaining that to a historical fencing purist. "Oh yes, I left my torso open deliberately, but don't worry, I had an invisible bubble blocking your cut." Or Igni the flamethrower sign. Nothing says. Effective battlefield control, like turning your opponent into a rotisserie chicken mid-swing. Real-life knights would have killed for that. Instead, they had boiling oil, which is both less portable and less cinematic. So, could Geralt survive a real duel? Against a human? Maybe, but only if he turned down the acrobatics. Against a monster? He's perfectly adapted. His fighting style is a hybrid, part genuine martial technique, part theatrical misdirection, part magical enhancement. That's why it feels so strange to watch. You're seeing something that isn't quite history, but isn't quite fantasy either. Now let's do some myth busting. The famous one man against a dozen soldiers trope. Forget it. In real life, the second you're surrounded, you're toast. But Geralt gets away with it because of a combination of mutant reflexes, armor-piercing swords, and again, the narrative cheat of being the protagonist. If a real knight tried that, he'd be skewered faster than you can say, "Toss a coin to your Witcher." Then there's stamina. Real duels lasted seconds, maybe minutes. 2 armored men swinging steel at each other quickly hit exhaustion. Geralt, meanwhile, can fight a 20-minute battle scene, break into a sprint, and still have enough breath to drop a sarcastic one-liner. Realistically, wow! He'd be sucking wind behind a tree, praying the monster got bored and wandered off. And let's talk gear. Geralt's dual sword system, 1 steel for men, 1 silver for monsters, is narratively brilliant, but logistically insane. carrying 2 longswords across your back would throw your balance off and wreck your scabbards within a week. Real mercenaries used 1 good blade and maybe a backup dagger. The dual sword thing works because Geralt has plot armor, an actual armor that weighs less than a leather jacket, but somehow stops claws, teeth, and steel. Don't ask too many questions. Here's the dirty truth. Geralt's style works because it's designed for maximum audience engagement, not maximum survival odds. The choreography is meant to dazzle the viewer, not preserve the fighter. In the same way, Errol Flynn's swashbuckling duels from the 1930s weren't real fencing, but still inspired a generation. Geralt's style is cinematic martial arts for the Netflix age. And you know what? That's fine. Because while medieval knights might have laughed at a pirouetting swordsman, modern audiences cheer. Still, there's something deeper going on. The Witcher isn't just about showing us cool fights, it's about giving physical form to Geralt's identity. He's half man, half monster, and his fighting style reflects that contradiction. It's disciplined and efficient one moment, then savage and unorthodox the next. It's a dance of control and chaos. That's why we watch, not because we believe it's practical, but because it feels like Geralt. Every spin, every flourish, every sign cast is character storytelling through combat. So, could a real person fight like Geralt? Not exactly. But should they? Absolutely not. Unless you're blessed with mutant DNA, superhuman stamina, magical reflexes, and a Netflix stunt team on standby, don't try this at home. The best you can do is learn a bit of longsword technique, maybe take up fencing, and enjoy the fantasy. Because that's what The Witcher is at its core. A fantasy of power, of resilience, of one man standing against the impossible and making it look good. In the end, Geralt's fighting style isn't about what's practical. It's about what's mythic. He fights the way we wish we could fight if the world threw monsters at us. And isn't that the whole point? We don't watch him to learn how to duel. We watch him to remember that sometimes the impossible is worth spinning for. There's a reason why every time Geralt draws his sword, we lean a little closer to the screen and think, wait, that actually looks real. It's not because we've secretly trained in 15th century fencing manuals. Most of us can barely swing a broom without hitting a lampshade. It's because his movements borrow just enough from real, historical European martial arts to trick our brains into thinking we're watching authentic combat. It's the illusion of realism, a kind of cinematic sleight of hand, where fact and fantasy mingle so seamlessly that we start believing The Witcher might actually survive outside of a Netflix set or a video game engine. Let's be honest. When Geralt drops into one of his stances, it looks nothing like the clunky sword fights we were fed by Hollywood for decades. You know the type. Endless overhead chops, swords clashing in slow motion, enemies politely waiting their turn to die. Instead, Geralt lowers his center of gravity, keeps his blade close, and cuts with clean efficiency. That's not just good choreography. It's straight out of the medieval fencing manuals written by masters like Fiore di Liberi or Johannes Liechtenauer. These guys weren't writing fantasy novels. They were teaching knights how not to get stabbed in the liver. And when Geralt shifts into a guard like posta di donna or vom tag, the audience might not consciously recognize it, but our subconscious does. It looks right. It feels grounded. But then the illusion slips, because Geralt isn't just cutting and thrusting like a German longsword fencer. He's spinning. He's pirouetting. He's throwing in flourishes that look more like ballet than battle. And sure, if you're fighting a Striga that can tear your head off in one swipe, maybe you want a bit of flourish to confuse it. But if Geralt ever fought an actual human soldier, that spin move would last exactly 1 second before somebody's spear found its way into his kidney. That's where the Hollywood filter comes in. What we're seeing isn't authentic martial combat. It's a heavily stylized remix designed to be beautiful, cinematic, and gameable. Take the video games, for example. If The Witcher 3 had Geralt fighting exactly like a 15th century fencer, players would be bored in minutes. Real fencing is about short bursts, quick kills, and a whole lot of waiting for an opening. Great for staying alive, terrible for player engagement. So, CD Projekt. Red took the skeleton of real swordsmanship stances, footwork, guards, and then wrapped it in fireworks. Suddenly, Geralt's whirling around like a human food processor, hitting buttons turns into combos, and you feel like you're channeling a real swordsman, even though you're actually breakdancing with steel. It's the same trick with the Netflix show. Henry Cavill famously studied real fencing techniques and pushed for more historically grounded movements. And you can see it in scenes like the Blaviken fight. Efficient cuts, controlled thrusts, even proper edge alignment. But no one's tuning into Netflix to watch two guys cautiously circle for 10 minutes. So in comes the cinematic exaggeration, the quick kills chained together in flowing sequences, the enemies falling perfectly in rhythm, the blood spraying at the exact right time. It's real swordsmanship dressed up for prime time, and that's why it works. The funny thing is, this mix of real and unreal has always been part of our media diet. Errol Flynn's swashbuckling duels weren't real, but they pulled just enough from fencing footwork to feel convincing. Star Wars lightsaber duels aren't based on actual weapons, but when Obi-Wan drops into a kendo-inspired stance, we nod and think, yeah, that looks legit. Geralt lives in that same space. The combat feels familiar because it nods toward genuine martial heritage, even if it's about as practical as fighting in leather pants while monologuing about destiny. So why does this matter? Because it's the reason Geralt's fights stay memorable. Pure realism would be too dull, pure fantasy too ridiculous. The Witcher threads the needle, giving us just enough historical flavor to anchor the spectacle, then sprinkling in enough Hollywood spice to keep it delicious. It's a dance half truth, half fantasy, and it convinces us that maybe, just maybe, if we picked up a longsword tomorrow, we'd look a little like Geralt. Spoiler, we wouldn't. We'd pull a muscle immediately. In the end, Geralt's combat is less about what's practical and more about what feels true. That's the magic trick. The moves echo real sword fighting just enough that our brains buy the illusion. The rest, the spins, the flourishes, the perfectly timed monster kills, is fantasy dressed up in armor. And maybe that's the point. The Witcher reminds us that even in a world of magic, monsters and mutant hunters, the line between reality and spectacle is razor thin and sharp enough to cut. Here's the thing about Geralt of Rivia. If you take away the yellow eyes, the gravelly voice, and the tendency to brood in candlelit taverns, he still wouldn't be like the rest of us. Why? Because his combat isn't just swordplay. It's a cocktail of magic, mutations, and moves that laugh in the face of physics. It's the kind of fighting style that makes you think, yeah, I could do that if I trained hard enough. Spoiler, you couldn't. Unless you also happen to have wolf genes, superhuman reflexes, and the ability to set people on fire with your hands. Let's start with the obvious cheat code. Signs. These are the baby spells. Geralt tosses out like he's ordering drinks. Quen for shields, Igni for fire, Ard for a good old telekinetic shove. Imagine you're in the middle of a sword fight and your opponent suddenly hurls a literal blast wave at you. No amount of fencing lessons from medieval masters like Fiore dei Liberi is going to prepare you for that. And this is where Geralt's combat goes beyond the illusion of realism we talked about earlier. Sure, he looks like a Hema, historical European martial arts nerd half the time, but then he casually drops a magical shield or melts a ghoul into barbecue. Realism? Out the window. And we love it. Then of course there's the speed. Oh boy, the speed. Geralt isn't just quick on his feet, he's basically operating on Witcher Wi-Fi while the rest of us are still on dial-up. Enhanced reflexes mean he can parry arrows mid-flight, dodge claws that move faster than a blink, and pull off combos that would throw out a normal person's back in 2 moves. Even Henry Cavill, who did as much of the Witcher stunt work as possible, admitted that Geralt's supposed superhuman quickness is impossible to translate one-to-one on screen. So the Netflix show cheats with fast cuts and choreographed flow. But the idea is the same. This guy moves like a machine built for carnage. Try pulling a Witcher pirouette in your living room and you'll probably smack your shin on the coffee table. Ah yes, the pirouette. The move that divides fans faster than a Gwen match gone wrong. Some argue it's just for show useless spinning that leaves Geralt open to attack. Others point out it's part of his style, confuse the monster, throw off its rhythm, and look absolutely fabulous while doing it. Historically speaking, real swordsmen didn't pirouette their way through battles. Spin too much, and you'll find a spear sticking out of your ribcage. But here's where Geralt gets away with it. He's not fighting other humans in armor. He's fighting manticores, bruxi, and leshens. You don't play by human rules when your enemies can teleport or vomit acid. In that sense, the pirouette isn't just for flair. It's a flourish designed for a supernatural world. And hey, it makes for great gifs. But what really seals the deal is environmental awareness. Geralt doesn't just fight with his sword. He fights with the room. Kicks off walls, flips over tables, uses the dirt itself to blind his enemies. He's basically Jackie Chan with a broadsword, turning taverns, forests, and ruined castles into playgrounds of death. That's something you don't often see in historical manuals because knights weren't flipping off chandeliers during real battles. But in a fantasy setting, it's not only plausible, it's essential. Monsters don't stand politely on flat ground waiting to be skewered. They attack in caves, forests, and swamps. Geralt adapts by becoming part acrobat, part swordsman, part demolition expert. Of course, all this comes at a price. The realism we cling to, the idea that Geralt's fighting feels right, is constantly being undermined by the sheer spectacle of it. He's not just bending the rules, he's breaking them in half and then setting them on fire with igni. And yet, that's what makes his combat unforgettable. If it were just hammer with a side of grunting, we'd lose interest. If it were just superhero antics with no grounding, we'd laugh it off as cartoonish. But Geralt dances in between, one foot in the manuals of medieval masters, the other in pure fantasy. So next time you see Geralt whirl through a battlefield, flipping, casting, and pirouetting like death itself choreographed a ballet, don't ask if it's realistic. Ask if it's entertaining. Ask if it feels true to the world he inhabits. Because at the end of the day, The Witcher isn't about realism. It's about fantasy, with just enough seasoning of reality to keep us hooked. And let's be honest, if you or I tried even half those moves, we wouldn't be monster slayers. We'd be in the ER explaining to the nurse how we pulled a muscle, fighting an imaginary ghoul with a broomstick. Here's the eternal Witcher debate. Is Geralt of Rivia actually fighting in a way that makes sense? Or is he basically cosplaying a Cirque du Soleil swordsman who just happens to decapitate drowners in between pirouettes? On one hand, his combat looks lethal fluid, adaptable, razor sharp. On the other, some of his moves look like he's auditioning for So You Think You Can Sword Dance. So which is it, efficiency or spectacle? Let's start with the theory. Real sword fighting, as recorded in manuals from fencing masters like Joachim Meyer or Fiore di Liberi, was all about economy of movement. You didn't waste time spinning or twirling, you struck, parried, and killed as quickly as possible. The logic was simple. The longer you flail, the more likely someone drives a spear through your chest. Geralt's style, by comparison, looks incredibly acrobatic. Spins, flips, even that signature pirouette. From a cold, tactical perspective, you'd think this is nonsense. But here's the catch. Geralt isn't fighting medieval knights on a muddy battlefield. He's fighting vampires that move like shadows and necrophages that don't exactly follow honorable duel etiquette. His extra flair isn't just about looking good. It's about confusing, redirecting, and adapting to enemies that don't think like humans. That said, we can't ignore the cinematic factor. In a Netflix fight scene, a quick thrust and parry might be historically accurate, but it's boring TV. Audiences want spectacle. They want to see the Witcher cut through a group of mercenaries like he's waltzing through a blood-soaked ballroom. So yes, a lot of those flourishes are deliberately for us, the viewers. They tell us, this isn't a grimy medieval mercenary. This is a mutated monster slayer who moves like his entire life is one long, violent dance. Brutal efficiency would work in reality. Stylish spectacle works on screen. Geralt is both. And neither. No. What about the classic one versus many scenario? Historical combat training prepared knights and soldiers for chaos. You weren't dueling one enemy, you were surrounded, shoved, and swarmed. The The manuals often stress tight formations and quick disabling moves. He strolls into a bandit camp alone and takes on 10 men at once. Realistically, that should end with his head on a spike. But this is where the Witcher advantage comes in. His mutations grant him superhuman reflexes, stamina, and perception. He doesn't just see where the nearest sword is coming from, he anticipates it. That kind of 360-degree awareness is impossible for ordinary humans, but for Geralt, it's second nature. This is why his flowing, acrobatic style works. Against multiple foes, the spins and wide arcs let him control space, keep enemies at bay, and slice across several attackers in one motion. Historically impractical. Sure. But when you've got Witcher senses and monster hunting reflexes, suddenly that pirouette makes tactical sense. Which brings us to the real heart of the matter, Geralt's job description. He's not trained to fight humans, though he's annoyingly good at it. He's trained to fight creatures. Wolves, vampires, insectoid horrors, spectral nightmares, you name it. His techniques are optimized for the unnatural. Wide arcs deal with beasts that lunge unpredictably. Acrobatics let him dodge claws that would rip apart a shield. Even his flashy flourishes have practical roots, confusing creatures with erratic movements, striking from odd angles, using agility to exploit weaknesses that armored knights never had to think about. He's not reenacting medieval battlefield tactics, he's rewriting them for a bestiary that no human knight could imagine. And that's why the effectiveness versus spectacle debate always circles back to the same conclusion: Geralt is both. To us, sitting safely behind our screens, it looks like he's being flashy for flair, showing off like a silver-haired showman. To him, it's survival. Every twirl, every flip, every over-the-top strike. It's part efficiency, part intimidation, and part sheer necessity against monsters that don't follow human rules. That it also looks insanely cool? Well, that's the bonus that keeps us glued to the screen. At the end of the day, The Witcher's combat is a paradox. Impossibly stylish, yet ruthlessly practical. Brutal efficiency dressed up in balletic spectacle. If you tried to fight like him in real life, you'd end up face down in the mud before you even finished your first spin. But Geralt isn't real life. He's myth, mutation, and monster-slaying legend. His style works not because it's realistic, but because it's his. And that's the magic of it. When Geralt moves, you don't just see a swordsman. You see a predator, a protector, and yes, a performer, all rolled into one. So, could a real fighter survive a battle with Geralt's flair? Absolutely not. But could anyone else survive in Geralt's world without it? Also, absolutely not. That's the Witcher equation. Spectacle and efficiency aren't enemies. They're the only way a man like him lives to fight another day. Geralt of Rivia was never meant to be a flashy action hero. In the pages of Andrzej Sapkowski's books, his fighting style is described with the kind of precision and fatalistic weight that makes you feel every stroke of the blade. It's not endless pirouettes and dance moves. It's controlled, economical, sometimes brutally ugly. Geralt doesn't fight to impress, he fights to survive. He fights to survive. When Sapkowski describes him moving, it's almost clinical. He reacts faster than humanly possible. His strikes come from unexpected angles, and his efficiency borders on terrifying. It's not art. It's anatomy, like watching a surgeon cut out rot, except the rot happens to be a snarling necker. But here's the problem. Books and screens don't play by the same rules. What works in the written word? The quiet dread of Geralt moving like death itself doesn't always translate well into games or television. And that's where the liberties begin. Let's start with the games. CD Projekt. Red had an unenviable task: turn Geralt's lethally efficient style into something players could feel. You can't just have one button that says kill monster. That's accurate, but it's also boring. So the combat became a blend of choreography and mechanics. Suddenly, Geralt is pirouetting, spinning, chaining combos like a medieval ballerino. It looks absurdly stylish. And that's the point. A video game lives and dies on feedback loops. Players need the satisfaction of impact, the the rhythm of blows, the drama of narrowly dodging claws. So yes, they took Sapkowski's descriptions and cranked them up to 11, designing something that looks cool and feels responsive under a controller, even if real-life fencing masters are shaking their heads somewhere. Now, Netflix. This is where things get truly divisive. The showrunners and stunt teams clearly wanted to strike a balance between gritty realism and operatic spectacle. Season 1's Blaviken fight? That was basically Geralt's mixtape. You've got the economical sword strikes Sapkowski envisioned, but with Henry Cavill's weighty, muscular presence turning every move into a bone-crunching spectacle. It's brutal, elegant, and bloody. Arguably the closest the adaptations have come to capturing The Witcher's lethal grace. And fans loved it. The internet declared it the fight scene of the decade. Then came later seasons, where the choreography leaned more on spectacle than substance. Suddenly, Geralt is fighting multiple foes in ways that look cool but stretch believability. Some viewers complained it felt more like Hollywood sword dancing than Witcher lethality. Others defended it, saying that Cavill was simply giving us a live-action equivalent of the games. Less gritty assassin, more mythic warrior. And there lies the eternal tug-of-war. Fans want their Witcher to be both brutally realistic and impossibly stylish. But you can't have it both ways. On the page, Geralt is closer to a scalpel. On the screen, he has to be a show. What's fascinating is how fan reception splits across mediums. Book purists often complain that the games and shows turn Geralt into something he's not. Too choreographed, too clean, too much spin, and not enough sting. Gamers counter with, yeah, but it feels badass. And the Netflix audience, many of whom never cracked open a Sapkowski novel, just want to see Cavill brood, grunt, and cleave through foes like a demigod. Each group defines Geralt differently, assassin, performer, or myth. The irony? Sapkowski himself has admitted he never obsessed over technical accuracy. He wasn't writing a fencing manual, he was building myth, mood, and metaphor. Geralt's fighting wasn't supposed to be reenacted blow for blow, was supposed to feel inevitable, like watching a storm roll in. The adaptations, in their own ways, are doing the same thing. They just pick different storms. So when people argue about which version is right, the books, the games, or the show, they're missing the point. They're all right because each medium has its own demands. Books thrive on psychological weight and implication. Games thrive on responsiveness and spectacle. Shows thrive on visceral, watchable drama. Geralt exists in all of them, but like a true Witcher, he adapts to his environment. And maybe that's the beauty of it. The blade changes shape, but the soul of the Witcher stays the same. Efficiency or spectacle, page or screen, Sapkowski's grizzled monster hunter always finds a way to feel inevitable. Whether he's a grim surgeon of steel or a pirouetting demigod of death, the end result is the same. Another monster down, another story to tell. And in the end, maybe that's the only truth that matters. Let's be honest for a second. Nobody watches Geralt of Rivia fight because they want a fencing lesson. If that's what you're after, there are hours of HEMA, historical European martial arts videos on YouTube where people in funny-looking helmets poke each other with longswords in painstakingly accurate reenactments. No, when we watch Geralt, whether in the games, the books, or on Netflix, what we want is the cool factor. We want the hair flowing, the grunt of exertion, the flash of silver slicing through the dark, and the moment a monster's head hits the dirt in glorious slow motion. Realism can sit quietly in the corner while we cheer for our brooding mutant swinging a sword like he's half executioner, half rock star. And the cool factor isn't just surface-level flash. There's something deeply satisfying about the way Geralt fights, because it reflects who he is. This isn't some noble knight waving around a blade for honor and glory. Geralt's style screams efficiency. Get in, kill the monster, get out. He doesn't linger over enemies, doesn't bask in triumph. When Sapkowski describes him, it's often about speed and inevitability, like death personified. In the games, this efficiency turns into the whirling ballet of combos, signs, and dodges which look choreographed but feel like survival instinct. And in the Netflix series, Henry Cavill's Geralt turns brutality into poetry. His swordwork has weight, but every motion is infused with the weariness of a man who has done this 1,000 times before. That's what keeps us hooked. The fight isn't just about killing something, it's about being Geralt. And oh boy, that connection to character is everything. Think of Batman without his martial arts, or Aragorn without his ranger. Gridget just doesn't land the same way. Geralt's combat style is his identity in motion. He doesn't talk much, he doesn't smile often, so the fighting is his language. Every decapitation is basically him saying, "I am not here for your nonsense." Every parry is, "Yes, I'm that good." Every pirouette, even the unnecessary ones, is, "Fine, I'll give you a show too." The fact that we understand him more by watching his fights than hearing his dialogue is part of why he resonates so deeply. Geralt's swordplay is character development with blood spatter. But here's where it gets spicy, the blend. Because if Geralt were only efficient, only ever cutting down monsters with surgical precision, it might get repetitive. You'd respect it, sure, but would you binge watch it on Netflix or sink 200 hours into The Witcher 3? Probably not. The brilliance is in how his style marries grounded technique with a sprinkling of fantasy flair. He'll use proper guard positions and realistic cuts, but then he'll toss in a flashy spin, a supernatural dodge, or a magical sign that sends monsters flying. That mixture keeps us leaning forward, caught between the thrill of "that looks real" and the awe of "that's impossible." It's the exact sweet spot where entertainment thrives, where authenticity shakes hands with spectacle. Think about the Blaviken fight in Netflix's first season. It wasn't realistic in the strictest sense. Real fights don't give you 6 perfectly spaced opponents lining up to die. But it felt authentic. The weight of the blows, the gore, the exhaustion on Geralt's face. It all sold the scene. And then the stylish choreography, the almost dance-like flow, elevated it into something unforgettable. That balance is why fans clipped it to death, called it iconic, and demanded more. It's the same balance that makes game combat addictive. You feel like a real swordsman, but you also get to be a mythic monster slayer. At the end of the day, Geralt's fighting style endures because it scratches multiple itches at once. For the purists, there's enough humor-inspired realism to nod along and say, yes, that's actually how a longsword could work. For the fantasy fans, there's enough spectacle to make you gasp. And for the casual viewer, it's simply cool. Watching Geralt fight is watching contradictions come to life. Brutal yet elegant, realistic yet impossible, grim yet exhilarating. And maybe that's why we can't stop coming back. Geralt isn't just fighting monsters, he's fighting for our attention and winning every time. No matter how many times he swings that silver sword, we're ready to watch again, because each strike carries the weight of who he is, the lonely, stoic witcher who turns violence into art and survival into legend. In the end, it doesn't matter whether the pirouette was practical or whether the spin was inefficient. What matters is that for a moment, as his blade arcs through the air, we believe in him. We believe in the Witcher. And that belief, that rush of awe and adrenaline, is why we'll always love watching Geralt fight